Welcome. We're going to learn how does one deliver successful transformations and strategic change. This term is used in multiple contexts, and we're going to explore exactly what transformation means, but you might have heard the word along the lines of digital transformation, finance transformation, culture transformation, supply chain, carbon net zero transformation, scale up, product and channel transformation. Irrespective of the type of transformation, 84% of these transformations fail. And more than 70% of organizations are undergoing some kind of transformation, which makes this a really critical skill set to have. My name is Jenny, and I will be guiding us through how to deliver these transformations. My background is in professional services, first in management consulting and then investment banking, and then leading transformations in-house successfully. I've been named a top 50 game changer in the UK for the successful delivery of transformation. And I'm representing Impakt It, which has also been named a top 50 game changer for its ability to solve why 84% of transformations fail and empower organizations and consultancies and implementation partners to deliver these transformations successfully. Until now, Impakt It's intellectual property that sits beneath solving why 84% of transformations and change fail and how to ensure delivering successful transformation, change and strategies has only been available within the software. We therefore felt very strongly about it being made readily available so that everyone is empowered to enjoy what they do every day and be successful in delivering their change. Before continuing, let's consider some of the contexts in which you might be applying these skills. You might be here to acquire the international best practice and knowledge in terms of how to deliver transformation and get your CPD points at the same time, or find a resource that might be helpful to your teams. You might be here because you are in fact using a lot of our really useful tools, such as the Insights and Purpose tool, the single point of truth, which is the colorful page that you will see throughout our training. However, there is actually the digital interactive one that does a lot of the hard work and calculation and synergizing and risk adjustments and pre-populating to save you time and production of presentations. Or you might be here because you yourself want to run transformathons, which is one of our wonderful programs that have proven extremely popular, and you're going to run a transformathon or acquire the skills to run a transformathon within your organization. Transformathons being like hackathons. You choose an objective, you get the team together, and you deliver it in the space of 2 days. Sometimes organizations have a tailored version and they do it in a little bit longer than that. But we run transformathons in 2 days. So bear in mind whenever we're going through all the content that it can be applied equally in every single one of these contexts. And I will do my best to point out at which points particular areas might be of more relevance. So who is Impakt It? Impakt It is first of its kind globally of transformation and strategy execution software. So we highlight its execution, not management software. It's very much focused on ensuring the actual outcome is delivered. And things such as project management software can easily be plugged into it. And we will focus on project management as one of the 13 key components. Now, why did this all come about? What you're looking at is a big mess of what transformations often look like, and having worked in the top tier consulting firms and delivered award-winning transformations in listed companies, as well as startups and scale-ups, there are a lot of moving parts, and unfortunately, if things aren't gone about in the right way, it does result in this very big mess. And actually, for the time and resource that is invested into transformation, one should be looking at an amazing unicorn at the end of it. So we are transformation execution software because we focus on two key elements that are critical in delivering transformation. That is, how does one deliver, one, the technical element correctly, and two, the people element. But these two need to be synthesized as if there was just one single approach. And more than that, it needs to be done in a way that is really easy for everyone to understand. So whether you are here as the chairman of a listed company, a medium company, or a small company, or you belong to the C-suite, such as the CEO or the CFO, or a manager or graduate, it needs to be really easy for everyone to understand so that everyone has the skills to play their role and continue to grow themselves, their team, and the organization. So we are out of Oxford University Innovation and have been named a top 50 game changer in the UK amongst a number of other awards. And really what we wanted to do is take all the IP, the intellectual property that we have uncovered in the process of successfully delivering transformations that up until now have only been accessible within the software, and provide it to everyone. And this intellectual property will cover both the technical and the people element and how those are synthesized together. And the great part is that it is CPD UK accredited. So whether you belong to the Institute of Engineers, Chartered Accountants, project managers, change managers, lawyers, there is the bonus of also getting your CPD points. So let's get started, and we're going to look at what is the structure of each one of these components that we're going to look at. And we're going to keep the structure consistent throughout so that we know exactly how all the parts come together. So every time we look at one of the components, we're going to be really clear on what is the objective of that component. Why is it that we need to know and understand and have the skills within that component? Then it's about why are we actually doing it? Why are we undertaking the actions? And how is it that that particular action is going to deliver transformation? Then we always look at the context, because each one of these components always interact with other components. And this is often the reason that transformations do fail, because people don't look at their interdependencies. And within each of those components, we need to understand exactly what the skills are and the concepts from those skills within each one of these components. And because we're all about the actual execution, we then need to know, how do we take all of this and put this into practice? And that is why we look at the step-by-step actions that we need to take in order to take these concepts and bring them to life. And right now we are at the introduction part, which is really important because there are going to be critical concepts that we need to cover here in order to be able to be successful within the 13 components. So what are the 13 components? And these 13 components are also a key element of Impakt It's intellectual property, and their amazing ability to have taken something that is incredibly complex and actually make it seem so obvious and easily color-coded for everyone to understand. So these 13 components, we're going to understand the concepts, but also more importantly, how they interrelate with each other in order to identify the risks and synergies. So the 13 components start with 1, the objective, or the problem that one is trying to solve for the transformation. There is then the customer and the channel. Now, there is always a customer, whether it's the actual external customer, or perhaps if you're a transforming team, you have an internal customer. There are the competitors and alternative elements, so that one ensures that one is delivering the best possible solution and also not reinventing the wheel where one does not need to reinvent the wheel. There is then the value propositions. These are the key components that one needs to undertake successfully in order to be successful. There are centers of excellence, that one of the most overlooked assets that an organization can in fact create, and we look at how to really identify easily what those are and how to deliver them successfully. There is then, of course, the vision, which mobilizes everyone to a true North Star as a result of that. And then there are the ways of working, the things that we often jump to before doing the groundwork correctly. And that is the actual step-by-step processes of delivering all outcomes and the technology that then supports that. Then, of course, we have all the resources, including the people resources, and how does one architect that based on where one is today versus where one needs to get to in the future, and all the myriad of steps that need to happen between now and then. Then, of course, one needs to prioritize it, but prioritize it in reality. We often have a very perfect theoretical plan, but that's not actually going to deliver the change. So we look at how does one prioritize, get that plan together, and make sure everyone is aligned on that plan. Then, of course, there's momentum and pace, and everyone wants momentum and pace. But this is something that is completely overlooked by all organizations, and we will see one of the most interesting components in how one brings technical execution together with the way the neuroscience of how the human brain works. Then we have change management, otherwise known as how does one take people along the journey, change their habits, upskill them, get their buy-in and engagement. Then there is the metrics component. That is, how do we actually measure the success? Also, how we measure where we are today and ensure that there is progress along the way to ensure that there is the ultimate outcome that we wish to deliver. And then there is the governance, and we're going to refer to this as dynamic governance. How does one ensure that there is delivery in a speedy way rather than a hindered way, but also in a way that mitigates risks and takes advantage of the synergies that are available? We are currently at the introduction and foundation, and this is really important because there are key concepts that we're going to explore in this introduction and foundation that are going to set us up for success in delivering the 13 components. So what does this word transformation actually mean? A purist might say to you that a transformation is a large wholesale change, something that dramatically changes the current state to the future state. However, practically, in the commercial reality, the word transformation gets used in a number of contexts, including something like process improvement. It could be digitizing a particular area of the business, or it could actually refer to the large wholesale change. We wanted to come up with something that is practically applicable in all situations in order for us to identify when something is a transformation. And so from Impakt It's perspective, a transformation is the ability of the organization, or perhaps it's a team within an organization, such as finance, HR, supply chain, that are going to deliver a particular change in their area, to deliver a change, an outcome, a future state, which we're all always working on, but within a context that is dynamic, i.e. our reality that's always changing. And so basically a transformation is the difference between where are we today, where do we want to get to in the future, and the size and the objective that we want to achieve is in fact the transformation. And therefore it might be a large or a small transformation, but it really is the gap between today and the future. Therefore, one might agree that transformations are actually just very complex strategies, and in some organizations the term can be used interchangeably. And in later components, one of the 13 components, we actually explore the use of the word transformation, because transformation from an emotional perspective can do a lot of damage within an organization, because a whole lot of alarm bells go off about what does this mean? Am I going to still have my job in the future? I don't want to change the way I do things currently. And there's a really smart way to go about it where we don't need to use the word transformation, where it ignites all this fear within people, and actually reframe it to be a purpose that everyone is driven by. And we're going to look at a really smart tool that actually does that from a quantitative perspective, and how we as people delivering transformation and empowering our teams to deliver change can use different words in order to achieve the same outcome. Some examples of different types of transformations so that we can be comfortable with how this term is actually used and applied. It could be a business-wide transformation. You might be part of an organization or leading an organization that is going to undertake a large wholesale change, which will affect multiple parts of the organization. It could be a product, sales, and channel transformation. This was quite common during COVID, where you saw organizations who only had bricks and mortar, i.e. tangible storefronts, move to online. This was a channel transformation. A product transformation could be introducing more products. Increasing sales could introduce new segments and new products. So that's an example of product sales and channel transformation. A business model transformation. Now, business model transformations are actually quite common without people actually realizing when one undertakes a different type of transformation, because it often changes the way different parts of the business work. But we refer to this as a business model transformation. This could go from perhaps someone buying something upfront for an amount and then actually rather paying a subscription amount rather than an upfront amount. This would be a change in a business model. Then we have something such as a finance transformation, an HR or marketing transformation, and this is where the function undertakes to deliver something or improve something or change something going forward as a function, or perhaps it's a team within that function. We have a supply chain transformation. Supply chain transformations manifest in all different ways. One could be digitizing an element of supply chain. Perhaps you're a part of an infrastructure where one is no longer able to provide certain elements within their supply chain the way that you used to, and therefore need to explore new avenues of delivering that part of the supply chain. And then we get something called digital transformation. Always a little bit nervous when hearing that organizations are doing digital transformation. There's not really entirely such a thing called digital transformation. Rather, an organization should be having a particular objective that they want to deliver that is very often supported by technology and the ability to digitize part or the entire component of that transformation. But one needs to know what the objective is in order to be able to choose what technology should be used and if technology should be used. Then we have something called process optimization transformation, and this is about process improvement. This can sometimes be, or it could be different too, a cost reduction. So very often one needs to reduce cost in order to reinvest into other value-adding activities. There is a culture transformation, and these are some of the most exciting. This is really about how do you bring employees together, improve engagement, improve retention, and create a culture that everyone loves coming to work for. And this could be a consequence of multiple companies merging, new geographies, changes after COVID, or just a C-suite that's really inspired to make the workplace even better than what it currently is. Then there is something called a private equity or venture capital-based transformation, where there has been a backing from one of these organizations. So one either transforms your entity in order to get ready for funding from one of these organizations, or after one has been funded, one then goes through a transformation to use that funding for scale. And something that is in line with this is a post-merger integration transformation. So perhaps one company has acquired one or several other companies, and it's about how does one integrate those two companies or three companies or four companies to deliver a synthesized organization as if it was one. And that could have many elements. It could include actual processes, it could be the people element, it could be the product offering. And so that is what a post-merger integration might look like. And then we have the ESG transformation. One of the most common ones within ESG is this carbon net zero transformation. How does an organization reduce their carbon footprint? Last one on our list, but certainly this list does not exhaust the types of transformations that one might get, is a post-COVID workplace transformation. Lots of changes as a result of COVID. Some organizations have a hybrid of in-office and out-of-office. How does one get it all working adequately so that we have the same, if not better, value than what one was achieving before COVID? So there are many other examples of transformation. I'd love to hear some of the transformations that you've been working on, so please do share that with us. But hopefully this gives you some insight into where and what transformation actually means. And so you might discover that you've actually been part of some type of transformation without actually realizing. The word transformation can be a little confusing and is often used interchangeably with other words. So all we need to know is a transformation is moving an organization or a team from its current state to a future state. And the size and the gap between the current state and the future state is the transformation. And that may be large or small, and therefore it could be used interchangeably with words such as change, innovation, strategic change, organizational team strategy. And for our purposes, we understand that it can be applied at all different levels, whether it's a large wholesale organization-wide change. It could be applied successfully just to a particular function or division, and equally to a small team. Now that we have recapped the word transformation, we therefore know that we can use the word transformation, strategic change, innovation interchangeably depending on the type of change that's happening. We personally use the word impact. So if you're using our software, you'll be familiar with this. And ultimately, we do this because whatever activity, energy, and resources are invested, whether at a team, organization, or function level, one wants to see an impact made. There needs to be a value that is put out from the particular change, and that could mean many different things depending on the type of transformation. In order to understand transformation, let's look at the moving parts of transformation as they are currently commonly accepted. There is the project management element. There are many organizations that have project management teams. Then there is the technical execution. How does one actually deliver the objective that one wishes to achieve? Now, many organizations have absolutely no idea, and actually this isn't a component that is completely undefined and is often completely overlooked. And then there's the change management element. Change management is a term that is just referring to how does one manage the change of people. So it's very much the people element. How do you change their habits? How do you upskill them? How do you overcome the resistance and get their buy-in? Now, these three elements just make up the transformation itself. However, it's often forgotten that transformation exists and has come about because of some kind of change in the external market or environment. And this is something that needs to be taken into account because the environment is always changing, and therefore the transformation needs to be able to dynamically adjust in order to still deliver the outcome. And then there is the complexity that transformations, unlike startups have the complexity of just getting up and running and creating their own cogs and wheels. However, transformation is one step a little more complicated because it exists in an environment where operations already are underway, i.e. there are existing processes, existing architecture of people, existing products, and the way that the business runs. And therefore, the transformation also needs to be successful, taking into account that this already all exists and everything needs to be harmonized and continue to work as one entity. Now, on top of this, there are the metrics that measure and drive each of these elements. So there are the metrics that get chosen to deliver the transformation. However, there are metrics for the existing operations. And unfortunately, there's not really an exercise done to reconcile these metrics. And often people are pulled in multiple different directions and people basically behave the way that they are rewarded, and they are rewarded based on performance, which is measured by metrics. And therefore, there is a big job to be done in making sure that one has the right metrics, both for the transformation and the organization, as if it was just one exercise. And that is really where the beauty of Impakt It's IP that we're about to explore throughout these 13 components comes in, because it sits at the center of bringing this all together. So there is just one single point of truth that everyone can understand, including how it all interrelates and what changes happen the minute any single one of these elements change. Why do transformations fail? So the current market is a little bit of a mess. As we mentioned, 84% of transformations fail. More than $7.4 trillion has been spent on this in the past 3 years. Sometimes want to say to organizations, we would have been better off just paying this amount of money to employees rather than putting them through the disruption and still failing and having wasted so much money. Currently, more than 70% of organizations are undertaking some type of transformation, and this rate is increasing. And organizations are going about this in all the wrong ways, using current industrial-based structures and processes in order to try and deliver change. The irony being that the need for change is because these industrial-based structures and the way we currently run processes and structures within the organization don't actually work. So current business thinking has unfortunately gone about it in all the wrong ways, because we're trying to use these industrial structures to solve digitally based era solutions. So let's look at the consequence of having gone about it in all the wrong ways. Firstly, there is compensatory complexity as a result of managing it under old industrial-based structures. So because we start with a structure that's not really supportive of delivering change in a fast and dynamic way, we start building compensatory teams and disciplines and projects to try and overcome this. However, we're making the problem progressively worse. The next thing we're really accustomed to doing is having static plans, but no plan ever worked out in reality. And therefore what happens is we create a big plan that organizations invest months and months and months into actually building. Something doesn't go according to plan. Everyone throws their hands up in the air. Everyone thinks it's a failure. There's wasted resources. And one then has to re-inspire people to try and get buy-in in order to remobilize it. So static plans in a dynamic reality are going to result in more problems. Then, ironically, there is no single point of truth. There are all moving parts in all different parts of the organization. There's not actually a single view of what's going on in the organization in a way that is easy to understand, and actually that all this activity is being measured, and there are interdependencies with different parts of the organization. And as a result, more chaos creates more chaos. And then whilst it sounds obvious, everyone's trying to change the masses of the people working in the organization by instructing them. So no push instruction is going to change anyone, just like a 5-year-old, a 35, 45, and 65-year-old doesn't want to be told what to do. And so the push instruction doesn't actually work. And we're going to look at how does one overcome this. And then there is actually no internal robust metric system. So often activity is not even baselined to begin with. Whilst this sounds fairly obvious, I think if one reflects on teams that one has worked into, often we jump to action without having actually baseline what is currently going on. So we can measure where have we moved from today in terms of progress up until the next point and ultimately to the future state that we want to achieve. And building on that, the ability to actually measure every single bit along the way so that we are actually delivering value that we think that we want to deliver, rather than not having metrics and being unable to know how much we've moved the needle. So if we had to recategorize those, they are technical drivers. So that's the industrial-based solutions and structures and processes don't deliver change in the new era. And as a result, there's compensatory complexity. So these are the technical drivers. The next lot of drivers are actually operational drivers, and that is that the static plans, the getting the job done, is treated as a static plan, and reality is dynamic, and so are people dynamic, and we don't know exactly the outcome of every single step. So operationally, we have set ourselves up for failure, and operationally, because there are parts all moving all over the show, we don't actually have a single point of truth that empowers us to understand where are we and what do we need to do in order to get to the next step. And of course, operationally, we need metrics. Where are we today, and what are we doing every single day, and what are the results of the actions that we're taking? And then there are people and behavioral drivers. These are the human elements, and that is all about trying to change the workforce habits by telling them. As we know, you can tell people to eat healthy food, but that's not actually going to change their habits. And the next part is relying on external consultants. Now, external consultants can be an incredibly valuable resource. It's just that you can't have consultants come into an organization, make the change, and then leave and think that the organization is going to continue working in the changed way. So there's always this element that if you're going to change something in an organization, the people within that organization need to change their habits and their skill sets and upgrade those. Sometimes it's a small gap, sometimes it's a big gap, in order to deliver the ongoing change. And lastly, from a human perspective, the human brain cannot possibly parallel process all those moving parts that we just looked at. One, be an expert in all of those areas and be able to calculate all the interdependencies and synergies of every single permutation. However, there is a baseline skill set, which is what we're here to learn, that empowers one to get this mobilized and simplify it. And obviously, if you're using the software, this is going to make your life a lot simpler because you have to use less brain power. But ultimately, up until now, all these moving parts haven't been synthesized, so the poor human brain just cannot parallel process all of it. But we're going to change that by the end of the 13 components. And lastly, the technical process that is currently used is often in conflict with the human brain's working. Now, the human brain works in a particular way, and there's nothing that we're going to do to change the anatomy of the human brain. However, the technical process needs to follow a particular process that aligns itself with the human brain. So rather than the current technical process that I say results in a very vicious cycle. So you make a plan, it doesn't work, then you lose buy-in, now you have to remobilize it, more effort to try and convince people. This is a very vicious cycle, and it's because it's not working in the way that the human brain is naturally akin to working. And we're going to look at this in great detail, specifically in the momentum and pace component. But ultimately, we just need to make some tweaks in that technical execution process so that it actually aligns with how the brain naturally works. And what one sees in organizations who have managed to do that is that there is something called a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle, where one action automatically leads to the next action and the next action and the next action. And all of these actions are positive actions in ultimately delivering the change. And this is basically going to result in a faster delivery of transformation, but also in a way that is very natural to the way humans work. And so it will be ongoing ever more into the future. What can we learn from the leaders of successful transformations? Alibaba, Netflix, Microsoft, Adobe, these are listed as some of the most successful transformations of the past few years, where we don't even realize that these organizations have undergone material transformations. And there are many other examples on this list of top 10 transformations that are not technology-based companies. So what is it that the leaders of these transformations know? Firstly, there is a culture of continuous innovation. So innovation is a key skill set of transformation, but there is additional complexity, which we'll look at, such as existing operations, etc., etc. There needs to be an alignment of purpose, and we're really mindful that the word purpose gets thrown around in a way that actually loses its meaning. And we're going to look at how one actually technically brings this to life in a quantifiable way. They use correct metrics. The metrics that one might use in your balanced scorecard often overlook the metrics that are ultimately going to deliver value to the organization in the long run. And we're going to look at what exactly are these correct metrics. They know that there is a dynamic technical process, i.e. the world is always changing. Things do not go according to plan. But if one anticipates and expects that the world is always changing and things do not go according to plan, and you have a process that works in that way, then it's not a surprise when something doesn't go according to plan, because it's just part of the process. And we're going to look at how one actually does deliver on that. And they know that there is a synthesized transformation skill set. It's not possible to have a project team running separately, change management teams running separately, someone in finance, someone in HR. people all over the show that might have their unique skill sets, but they don't have sufficient insight into the skills and the cross-functional skills that are required in order to deliver transformation, which is obviously one of the reasons that we're here exploring what exactly is the synthesized skill set. But these leaders of successful transformations have people in there who have acquired the synthesized skill set, and they know that the internal resources are required in order to deliver the actual change. These are the people who are delivering and doing the doing every single day in the organization. They have the knowledge of the nuances and the intricacies, and they're going to continue delivering operations going forward. And therefore, these leaders know that one requires the internal resources in order to get the transformation done and continue delivering it afterwards. To build on this, at Impakt It, because we've gone through hundreds and hundreds of interviews, transformations, transformathons, expressly to identify how does one deliver successfully and avoid this 84% failure rate, we're able to build on why these things have been successful and go quite a number of layers deeper to the root cause in order to deliver successful transformation. So what are these? The first is purpose. And we don't want to be flippant about using the term purpose so that it becomes throwaway. We're actually able to technically quantify and ask every single individual to design their individual purpose, the team's and the organization's purpose. And we know that there is a 95 to 98% correlation between what individuals will design as their purpose and what the leadership ultimately design as their purpose. And what this helps one do is completely reframe transformation from something that's sounding like a threat to actually saying, thank you for your input. We're going to empower you to go away and fulfill the purpose that you have actually identified. Now, if you are using the Insights and Purpose tool already, then you've already seen the outcome of this, where the technology will automatically collect this from every single individual and do the correlation for you. If not, please do just be in contact with us and we can provide that to you. Right, the next thing that we know is that there needs to be a simplified view. Something that takes all these moving parts and helps the human brain just easily process it in one view. And we're going to look at the single point of truth. That's the color-coded page that's made up of the 13 components. And we're going to use that throughout. But we know that there needs to be something that's really simple and easy to understand, that whether you're the chairman, the CEO, or the graduate, everyone can follow it and it makes perfect sense. The next thing is transform resources. So we call it transforming whilst performing. Everyday resources have the unique knowledge that one needs to actually be successful in a transformation to begin with, and therefore they will also be continuing to run their operations after something has been transformed, and therefore one needs to empower and transform the resources also. And the fourth thing that we know is that momentum is everything. One needs a technical process that actually delivers people momentum at the same time. And the people momentum is going to deliver the technical momentum, which is why that process of technical and people need to be synthesized into one single process. And actually, if we move around and include some elements that haven't been done before and change the order of the ways things are currently approached, it's actually really easy to achieve correlating the technical execution with the neuroscience of how the brain works. And we're going to get to that in more detail very shortly in one of the later components. And then there are metrics, and metrics basically need to align the innovative part of delivering transformation with the existing operations, which might be recorded in existing key performance indicators, balance scorecards, OKRs, depending on what framework the organization actually uses. And we learn this from Eric Ries's Innovation Accounting, which if any of you have read The Lean Startup, he goes into great detail about this. But innovation accounting is a lesson that we can learn, and we are going to explore something called transformation accounting, which helps us identify the right metrics that will both drive momentum, but also measure where value is actually created so that we can really expedite areas where value has been created and keep the organization on track. Having stepped through at a high level the multiple drivers behind why 84% of transformations, changes and strategies fail, and looking at the factors present in the few that are successful, we can see that the current approach really does need an overhaul. So rather than overcomplicating it even further, we take a step back and say, well, what happens if we could just start from scratch? And ultimately, what we want to do is actually execute, do so with momentum, and be able to actually measure the outcome. So these are the key things. The first thing we need to do is ensure that there is alignment. This is an alignment of an individual's purpose, every single individual, whether it's 3 or 3,000. The alignment with the leadership and alignment with the organization's purpose. And this needs to land up being one and the same purpose. This alignment requires one accounting for both quantitative factors as well as qualitative factors. And doing this will empower us to change a negative push instruction that is associated with change and transformation to a positive pull opportunity and actually harness those intrinsic motivators in people. And we're going to look at how we can achieve this. We also need to ensure that there is a single point of truth that is dynamic. Dynamic in the sense that it can adjust to any changes that occur internally as well as externally, and in a way that is really easy for anyone to understand, whether you are on the board, the senior executive, or at a graduate level, with all of the different activities integrated so that it identifies synergistic opportunities and any sort of interdependencies and risks. And we need to do this so that there is one process. The technical processes and the people processes need to be one and the same. And to do this in a way, what we call transforming whilst performing. Whilst actually delivering the change, one is transforming the processes and the internal resources and closing any skills gaps. And most importantly, being able to measure throughout the transformation what progress and benefits are being created. In starting from scratch, let's take these key components that have simplified the approach and see how we can implement them. To achieve the alignment of all the individuals, the leadership, and the organization's purposes as if it's one and the same purpose, both quantitatively as well as qualitatively, we have an insights tool. It achieves this by identifying every single individual's current state and the future state they wish to see for themselves, the team, as well as the organization at large. And we know that there is a 95 to 98% correlation between what individuals ultimately see in their future compared to that of what the organization ultimately designs as their future strategy and changed, transformed state. This is done in such a way, however, that it actually quantitatively baselines all the current operations. And this sets us up for making informed decisions at the same time as aligning everyone and inspiring people, because purposes are aligned, but in a way that is actually quantifiable. If you're not using our software, you can reach out to us so that we can give you access to this Insights and Purpose tool so that you're at a starting point that is quantifiable. The next thing is, how do we achieve this single point of truth that can respond to any sort of change and is easy to understand? And we have the single color-coded, what we call SPOT, single point of truth, where it integrates all the different synergies and interdependencies, as well as all the risks and all the components and how they interrelate with one another. And this is part of why we're here, is learning the skill sets and identifying what all these components are and how we actually execute and bring it to life. This single point of truth is used from architecture throughout the execution and scaling, where everything is continuously delivered and measured. And this is because one is always interacting with these different 13 components as one goes through each step of the execution, irrespective of the type of transformation or the phase that one is in. And because we're all about the execution, it comes down to this one process that marries the technical execution with everything that people are doing, because up until now, these have been treated very separately. But because people are actually delivering the technical execution, these two things should not be separated. And so we have something that's called Transforming Whilst Performing platform, which is basically gamified the work that one is doing to deliver any sort of change. And throughout the actual execution, the transforming whilst performing, one is always measuring any sort of benefit that is achieved. And even if you're not using the software, where this is already all automated and inherently measuring any sort of benefits, identifying any synergies, any risks and interdependencies, and feeding it all back to the single point of truth, by going through the 13 components, one is actually upskilling in each of these areas so that one is able to ultimately bring it together. So even if one doesn't have access to the software, one has actually been upskilled both technically and with the soft skills to be able to achieve the outcome irrespective. And so it's easy to see why we needed to set aside the highly complicated, over compensatory approach that was driving the 84% failure rate, and take a look at something that is fresh and clean, that makes logical sense, and is ultimately going to deliver any sort of change or strategy in a way that accounts for both the technical execution, the people elements, and does it in such a way that is really easy to measure. A simplified, fresh approach that ensures both the delivery efficiently as well as effectively. We're now going to explore the key concepts within the introduction and how to apply it. Firstly, we're going to learn all about the single point of truth and the 13 components that make up the single point of truth and how they interrelate with one another. The next is, what is the synthesized transformation skill set, i.e. what are the 13 components that we need to have a certain level of skill in each area in order to have the synthesized transformation and strategy execution skill set. We're then going to learn about an MVT, minimum viable transformation, akin to an MVP, which many of you may have heard of, a minimum viable product. So we're going to look at a minimum viable transformation. We're then going to look at what we mean by different phases. We're going to look at design thinking, which we're going to be experts in by the end of transformation. And we will just highlight what those elements of design thinking are so that you know that you are in fact pulling on what is technically referred to as design thinking. And we're going to look at the adoption curve, which is really interesting. Let's recap on the moving parts of transformation and reframe it through a lens that lends itself towards practical execution and implementation. It's this particular intellectual property that has proven invaluable, that has been developed by Impakt It to empower organizations and teams to deliver actual change, strategy, and innovation, as well as implementation partners and consultancies in empowering the organizations that they consult to and implement for to deliver the change successfully. As we continue to emphasize, Impakt It is not a methodology or a framework, and we'll see in a moment why the intellectual property is simply there to facilitate empowering teams, organizations, consultancies, and implementation partners that support the organizations to deliver successful transformation. There are a number of different methodologies and frameworks which we highlight throughout the execution, which one can pull on, but whichever methodologies and frameworks that one might like to use or have a preference for, we just highlight how they work within the broader range of intellectual property that is available. So let's take a look at the moving parts of the transformation and then reframe it. As we recall, people traditionally associate project management with delivering particular strategy, change, or transformation. And then there is the technical execution of the transformation itself. Organizations haven't entirely worked out how to do this successfully. And then there is a term called change management, which refers to the people part of change. And these are just the moving parts of the transformation itself. However, transformation is a response to external factors. It's either external factors to the team that's transforming, which may require consideration of internal factors within the organization, or it's a change to the actual external market. And therefore, one has to always be able to respond to changes in the external market and environment in order to continuously deliver transformation as the transformational change or strategy progresses. In addition to this, a transformational change or strategy exists within an already existing team or operation, and therefore it already has existing processes, existing technology, existing resource architecture that needs to be accounted for. And on top of this, there are going to be metrics that are measuring the particular change, and there are metrics that are already measuring the ongoing operations. Often these are in conflict with each other, however, we look at that in a later stage. But one needs to just be mindful that in order to deliver a successful strategy, change, or innovation or transformation, all these moving parts need to be accounted for. Now, these are just the moving parts, and we as Impakt It look at it from a different lens. Impakt It is all about delivering the actual output and focusing on the execution. And therefore, we're going to look at all these different moving components through an operational lens. We're looking at the moving parts of the transformational change or strategy, but through a practical, commercial, and operational lens. So we're taking each one of those parts and breaking it down into components that are articulated in practical, commercial, and operational value. There are the external market or external environment to the particular change. So if you're an internal team that was changing, the external environment is everything external to your team, even if it's still internal to the actual organization. And there are also the external market environments. We then have the blue, which is the backbone to any particular strategy, change, or innovation. The yellow is representative of internal existing operations, processes, technology, resource architecture, plans, priorities. Green is governance. Governance refers to both the technical governance covering risk as well as the people governance. How does one manage the risks around people and getting them to behave and act in a way that continues to run the business in the most optimum way, adopting any changes where necessary? And therefore, we can see that these particular activities can be broken down further into particular components. And that's where our 13 components come from. Stick with me and it's all going to make sense. And this will also highlight why Impakt It's IP is not a particular methodology or framework, but actually it's just organizing all the practical factors that one needs to take into account in reality in order to manage and deliver any organization or team's strategy, transformation, innovation, or change. So we can look at project management, which is going to be made up predominantly by activities which are centered around governance. However, one also needs to account for practical everyday operations. For example, processes and technology may very well fall into project management activity. In the context of the project management part of any particular change or transformation, the blue refers to the backbone, particular elements of metrics. Metrics are always measuring the progress of particular projects or elements, and there may be other things such as the problem that one is aiming to solve. This is all going to make sense in a moment, but as we can see, each one of the moving parts is made up of a different composition of further subcomponents. So we have the change management, which is centered around people governance. We have the technical execution, which lends itself and is reliant on all the different components. These make up the actual change or transformation, which still exists within the internal operations that are currently running, as well as having to account for the external market, all of which is being measured by metrics. And so we can see if the human brain had to take all of these parts, break it down into their subcomponents, and still manage the interdependencies, the risks. What happens if one part changes within the actual technical execution? What does that mean in terms of the project management part? What does it mean in terms of people? Hang on a second, what happens to the current existing operations? And then what happens if something changes in the external market? So there are a lot of moving components, which actually, it's just way too much for the poor brain to humanly process. And so in order to accommodate the limitation of the human brain being able to parallel process so many moving parts, we need to come up with a way that helps the human brain organize it, understand it in a really easy to understand way, and then building on that, understand how do all the interdependencies work. And then behind every single one of these components, what is the best practical way to execute against it and deliver that particular element or component, without falling foul to overlooking particular interdependencies or risks or operational execution errors. Let's look at Impakt It's intellectual property that helps us organize all these moving parts to practically bring this to life. We're going to look at what we call the spot, the single point of truth, a simple color-coded page that accommodates all the moving components, as well as any methodology that organizations like to use in all the various components. We're going to look at the interdependency pyramid, which helps us understand how do all the interrelated components rely on and impact one another and each other, which helps us identify risks, mitigate them, and also identify synergies in order to understand the most amount of value that can be created. And then when we go through each one of the 13 components, we do highlight step-by-step executions, which are highlighting the gold standard best practice, but we do it in a particular order because this particular order helps overcome the cognitive biases. Those are the common errors that we all as human beings make in some way, shape, or form in order to ultimately deliver the best possible outcome in the shortest amount of time, making the least number of errors as we go along. If you are using the software, you'll see that all of these things are already automated and built in there and measuring one's progress throughout the execution at the same time as upskilling one. But we're going to look at this throughout the 13 components so that even if you choose not to use the software, one is still empowered to deliver change within one's team, division, or organization. So let's look at how all these different commercial or operational components come together in a really easy to understand form. Now that we've looked at the different parts of transformation through a practical operational and execution lens, we can see that each one of these parts are made up of a number of different commercial and operational factors. And they all interrelate with one another, and therefore we need to find a way where it's really easy for the human brain to understand and process everything that's going on externally and internally, as well as maintaining focus on what one is actually trying to deliver. And therefore we have something that is called the single point of truth. So we use the acronym SPOT so that we don't have to keep saying single point of truth. But let's break it down. Now, when we break it down, we will see that it doesn't matter what type of change or transformation one is undertaking, it can be applied successfully and ubiquitously across all those different types of transformation. And this is because it accounts for all the external factors, all the internal factors, maintaining governance, as well as maintaining focus on what one is actually trying to deliver. So if we were to break down first the external factors, we can see it is made up of a customer and channel. One always needs to consider the competitors and alternatives, as well as understanding what are those centers of excellence? What do we have to be really good at in order to service the external customer to the particular change or transformation? And that particular customer may be internal or external, as we have seen and will continue to see when we look at the different components such as customer and channel. We then always need to maintain focus on what the anchor is of what we're trying to deliver, whether this is a business-wide strategy or change or simply at a team level. And this is always going to be made up of a problem or objective. There are the value propositions. What are the core value components that one has to deliver on? This will ultimately form the vision, and this is continuously measured with metrics. And very importantly, the secret ingredient, which is all about momentum and pace. How does one mobilize the momentum, engaging the internal resources and external resources to deliver the output that one wants, but within the time frame that one actually has? And this means that one needs to therefore be very mindful of and continuously accommodate the existing internal operations, which is comprised of processes and technology, as well as the resource architecture, which needs to account for both the current state of the resource architecture, what those teams need to look like in the future, and how does one go from today to the future? And this lends itself towards how does one actually prioritize within the practical limitation and constraints of the resources, processes, and technology that one has at hand, and therefore plan and get alignment in line with what is practically possible. And then how do we underpin and maintain this with the right governance? Both technical governance as well as people governance. And people governance, here we term as change management. And we're going to see how each one of these 13 components are broken down and accommodated for in terms of their practical execution and all the different methodologies, tools at our disposal that ultimately can deliver the change. We can see from this that we're not a methodology or a framework. We're simply facilitating all the moving parts that are required both internally and externally to successfully deliver any sort of change, both at a really large scale as well as at a small scale. If one is part of a large transformation program or broader organization strategy, one can see how all these moving parts can aggregate up into a literal single point of truth, which can then be disaggregated down into as many different components as what is necessary to deliver the change. And this is because the 13 components is intentionally designed to exhaustively cover all the different components, both externally and internally. And no matter what type of change one is delivering against, every single one of those changes will need to touch on each one of these 13 components. And so whilst the 13 components is representative of all the different operational execution parts that are required to run a team or organization, what it is also highlighting is a foundation skill set that everyone needs to have, Because whether someone is a specialist in technology, in finance, in customer operations or strategy, one needs to pull on the fundamentals in each one of these particular components in order to deliver change successfully and run teams and organizations successfully. So let's first look at the separate 13 components, and then we'll understand how it translates from all these moving elements that we explored in the introduction to the single point of truth. So the first thing is the problem or the objective. The problem or the objective is ultimately what the transformation needs to deliver on or solve. This might be something that is external, or it might be something that is internal. The next component is customer and channel. One always has a customer and channel, even if it's not the external customer and channel. So if, for example, it was a channel or product transformation, it may very well be the external customer. However, if perhaps you were doing a finance transformation or an HR transformation, your customer may very well be an internal customer. For example, if it was a finance transformation, the board, the sales team, the marketing team consume the data and reports that one produces, and therefore they are your customer, even though they are internal and would each have their unique channels through which one would be most effective in delivering valuable outcomes. Competitors and alternatives teach us about what works and what is in demand, and also helps us not reinvent the wheel where something is already working successfully, and we're going to have a look at that. The next element is, what are our value propositions? And there should not really be more than 3 to 5 value propositions, whether it's at an organization level or whether it is your team that then ultimately needs to deliver on a particular objective. It should really not be broken down into more than 3 to 5. Organizations that have more than 3 to 5 objectives, i.e. the value propositions, the things they're going to deliver on, have often set themselves up entirely for failure. And we're going to distill how exactly we get to the 3 to 5 objectives. Based on those 3 to 5 objectives, it makes it really clear what are the activities that this organization needs to be really, or team needs to be really, really good at in order to be successful in delivering value in the most effective and efficient way. Now, a center of excellence does not refer to a discrete team. However, a team could also be a key element in a center of excellence. However, we're going to find out exactly how do we create the center of excellence, whether it's a team or a cross-functional hybrid of different resources, and how do we use this center of excellence to become a differentiated either team, division, or organization. And all of this will help us inform exactly what the vision is. And this vision is that true north, and it brings together all of these things in a way that is inspiring for everyone to get on board and understand exactly what's going on. And this, of course, is going to be underpinned by a culture, the way one wants the organization to work and make decisions in order to be successful. This then has to be brought to life. And this is where the next element comes in. And that component is on ways of working, which is made up of 2 key parts. One is the processes. What are the processes, and every single step within those processes and how they interrelate that is going to deliver this technical execution. And then there is the technology element, and that's really about identifying what infrastructure do we need from a technology perspective and what applications are going to support delivering that value proposition, and being really mindful in what technology gets chosen and the context of the broader technology that is in use, so that it actually delivers an outcome rather than one having a whole big jumble of applications that don't speak to each other and ultimately don't deliver the value that one needs. Now, this all needs to be supported by actual people, and therefore we need to look at the resource architecture. And within resource architecture, we need to discover what is the team structure, skills, and resources that we have in place today. What does it need to look like in the future? And then there are going to be multiple steps between the current state and the future state, which is supported by resources, which are going to have to be architected in a particular way, so that individuals understand their journey from where they are today and where they're going to be in the future, so they don't feel that there's always some kind of role change or restructure, but actually it's part of a journey that's just taking them from their current state to the future state. And this is done in a way that will ultimately deliver value in the most effective and efficient way, but also upskill resources in a very engaging and inspiring way. This brings us on to the next element, which is all about ensuring that one has made the correct list of priorities and implemented that in a plan where everyone is aligned in delivering that plan. Very often in an organization, a list of priorities are created that are highly theoretical, but when it comes to the practical reality of implementing them, it's not really a practical order of implementing those priorities. One really has to account for how does one deliver momentum and live within the constraints of what resources does one have on hand, how much capacity do those resources have, and how do we use those limitations to deliver the most amount of value in the shortest period of time. And we're going to have a look at this when we look at the particular component on priorities and plan. And the next component is one of the most critical and totally overlooked components, and that is how does one create momentum and pace. And this is where the neuroscience of the human brain needs to be aligned with the technical execution. And very often if one has to look at the actual process on a process map of processes that are in place that one wants an organization's resources to deliver on, that process is completely counterintuitive to how the human brain naturally works. This is similar to the process that one uses in order to roll out a transformation. And so within momentum and pace, we go in and we look at the hook models, the habit loops of the human brain, and how we can make small but very clever tweaks to the processes in place, the technology in place, and the approach in order to create a virtuous cycle that ultimately creates exponential momentum. This brings us on to change management. And change management, as we mentioned, is just the technical term used for how do we take people on the journey of change, mitigate the resistance that they might have, get their buy-in, and for me, most importantly, how do you change their habits from what they're doing today to what you want people to be doing in the future, also in a way that upskills them. And more than anything, it is aligned to their individual purpose. So this is what we're going to look at in change management. Now, tying all of this together, as we looked at earlier, is what we call key metrics. Different organizations use different terminology. It could be called your key performance indicators. Perhaps you have a balanced scorecard. OKRs is one of the more fashionable things at the moment. So OKR stands for objective and key result. And what we're going to do when we look at metrics is say, well, what are the metrics that one needs to use in order to deliver transformation? But more than that, not what are the metrics, but why do we use those metrics? What is the process that needs to underpin it? And this is where we learn a lot from Eric Ries's The Lean Startup. And we borrow key learnings from innovation accounting. And we need to marry that to the existing key performance indicators in balanced scorecard, and we use something called transformation accounting. And basically what transformation accounting is doing is ensuring that every single component that will ultimately deliver the change is in fact producing the value that that particular component is meant to produce. Let's use a working example of revenue. So if an organization, for example, was always measuring revenue, or some kind of transformation was meant to increase revenue, and all one looked at was revenue as a metric, the problem with that is if one is measuring revenue, it's not really measuring the engine that generates the revenue. And as a result, it is not uncommon for organizations to appear as if their revenue is increasing. However, it doesn't identify that the engine that is generating the revenue is actually currently impaired. And so it only starts showing up in the actual revenue numbers months or years later, at which point it's far more complex to go back and mitigate the problem. This is where transformation accounting is highly effective in delivering both transformation and a far more successful organization, because what it does is it breaks down one's transformation and operations into key elements that are ultimately delivering that engine of value and that engine of growth, so that when one delivers the transformation in whatever approach one chooses to do so, one's able to identify which elements are actually producing value and which ones are not. It's also going to be highly effective in driving good human behavior in creating that virtuous cycle. But this is all going to make sense when we get to the metrics component and we explore both the people element, the technical element, and how transformation accounting brings together innovation and the existing balanced scorecard and metrics that the organization is using. And component number 13 is governance, and governance is how does one actually deliver the change in a dynamic way. So we call it dynamic governance, so that it's not hindered. Governance is there to safeguard one from risk and make the best of potential opportunities that perhaps have not been identified before, but it needs to be done in such a way that it doesn't actually suffocate the transformation. And so we call it dynamic governance, and we're going to look at how that all comes together in the governance component. Now, if I'll just quickly touch on how this color coding actually brings it to life. So when you look at the single point of truth, The blue is the foundation and the backbone of the transformation. The red represents the external component. So even if it is an internal transformation, you still, as a team that's internally transforming, have external customers. The yellow is the internal operations of the organization, and the green is the governance, both from a people governance perspective as well as from a technical governance perspective. And so what you're looking at is a really easy to understand single point of truth, that whether you, the chairman, the CEO, a manager, or graduate, one can use this to easily understand and implement a transformation from architecture throughout execution. And these 13 components have broken down all those moving elements that comprise transformation in a way that is actually operational in order to execute. And so going forward, we're going to explore every single one of these components once we have completed the introduction and how to practically bring each of these to life. We keep mentioning how each of the 13 components interrelate with one another. And so we have this amazing piece of intellectual property called the interdependency pyramid. And so even if you're not doing a transformation and it's just some really simple strategy within the organization, it's helped one distill how do all these moving elements of both the external market and the internal operations actually interact with one another. So when it comes to decision-making time, if a particular one of those 13 components is impacted, what does that mean in terms of how it impacts any of the other elements? What areas need to be changed? What areas do not need to be changed in order to ensure that one is still successful? And so we have something called the interdependency pyramid, and it takes these 13 components and it educates one on how they interplay with each other. What we will see is that on a pyramid, anything that is above a component on the pyramid, if that component gets changed, it means that every single component above it needs to be revisited in order to make changes to still deliver the outcome of the original component that got changed. Don't worry, we're going to play this through. Where it is indicated that a component requires changing, a change can only be made to a particular component in such a way that when that change to that component occurs, it will still deliver the same outcome that is currently architected in every single component that appears below that component. However, once that change has been made and it still honors everything below that component, we then revisit everything above that component because every single item above that component is likely going to require some kind of change. We're going to play this out. So let's have a look. Right at the bottom, we have customer and channel. Now, the reason that customer and channel is at the bottom is they are always going to inform one what the true problem or objective is. Now, should the customer demonstrate that we have in fact identified their need incorrectly, this means that the problem will have changed. So therefore, any change in the customer is going to result in everything above it changing. Above the problem or the objective, we have competitors and alternatives. It's then the vision from that is created. Based on that, we're able to break down our vision into value propositions, so the 3 to 5 key things that need to be delivered in order to be successful. This will determine the centers of excellence that one needs to be really excellent at. This informs the process and technology that then needs to be created in order to deliver on these centers of excellence that will deliver the value proposition and the vision. Having clarity on what the processes and technology are, this empowers us to understand what the resource architecture needs to be, both today, in the future, and the journey of getting there. From this, we are empowered to identify the tweaks and changes and architecture that needs to be in place in order to deliver momentum and pace. This will help us ensure that we have the correct order of our priorities, which ultimately translate into a plan upon which everyone needs to have alignment. This will inform the change management element, which helps us identify governance, and this therefore is completely topped off and continuously measured by, of course, our metrics. This may very well seem like a lot to take in, and we are absolutely going to get to this in far greater detail in the components that follow. Let's just play it out with the value proposition, which sits somewhere in the middle of the pyramid. The value proposition, if one was to look at the value proposition and decide, we'd like to change the particular 3 to 5 components that we're actually going to deliver. One can't haphazardly just change those components unless we can answer the question that everything below it on the pyramid will still be honored based on that change. We can only change that value proposition if it means that the customer and channel that we're addressing are still going to be serviced and addressing the actual problem and objective that we've identified as most important. We also need to ensure that have we needed to reconsider what we're actually delivering based on the competitors and alternatives? And therefore also if the vision is going to change, it also means that the value propositions are going to need to change. However, if we're confident that the changes to the value proposition still deliver each one of these items below the pyramid, we then need to look at all the items above the pyramid and be sure that we've made changes. For example, a change in value proposition is going to change processes. It's going to potentially change technology, team structures, the types of metrics that are being measured, as well as the governance in place. This should give us a solid understanding of how to apply the interdependency pyramid. We look at the particular component, we ask, can we actually make the change? The answer is yes, only if it honors everything below it on the pyramid. And when the answer is yes, it means that everything above it on the pyramid needs to be revisited with tweaks being made where relevant. We're going to look at how to prevent people making common mistakes, both from a technical, strategic, and operational perspective in many different types of transformation contexts in more advanced stages. But for now, we're going to just touch on the foundation, one, so that we understand why do we need those 13 components organized in a way that the brain can easily understand why it's important to understand the interdependencies and risks, and also understand why when we step through the 13 components, are we approaching and recommending approaching it in a particular way in order that it actually overcomes these common errors that the human brain makes. Let's take a look at the list of the most common ones. The technical term for this is a cognitive bias, and cognitive biases fall in the field of heuristics. We're going to look at the most common ones that arise during the execution of a particular change or strategy. One might even find whilst we're going through this that one falls foul of some of these things on a daily basis, or one might even recognize it in other people within one's personal lives as well as in one's work sphere. The first one is the availability heuristic. This is estimating the probability based on how many examples come to one's mind. And because everyone is different, the types of examples that would pop up into one's mind is likely skewed in comparison to what the objective reality is. And therefore, one is often very sure about something that actually objectively would probably not be accurate. The next one is the status quo bias. This is the desire for people to like to keep things the same. The next one is apophenia, and this is seeing patterns in randomness. So this is where people think that they have observed a particular pattern, but actually that pattern is more randomness. There is a saying that says, is it correlation or causation? Because often people think that something is a causation outcome, i.e. something caused something to happen, but actually maybe it was just correlation. So it happens to be that it correlates with a particular factor, but that particular factor is not the driver of the outcome. The next is called a framing bias, and many of us are guilty of this, or at least definitely observing it on a daily basis. And this is where information is presented in a way to give a certain impression, and one needs to maintain one's objectivity in assessing information. The next is a confirmation bias, and this is where we pay attention to something that confirms an existing belief. However, that existing belief may not actually be a factual reality, but because we have been exposed to something before and therefore have a particular belief, we tend to pay attention to things that confirm that particular belief. And this will likely set us up for making errors when designing and executing a change or transformational strategy. The next is the anchoring bias, and this is where one is overly influenced by the first piece of information. And therefore, when one is designing and executing a transformation, one needs to maintain objectivity and be open to exploring and interrogating all information before deciding what one needs to proceed with. Then there's something that's called the false consensus effect. This is where it overestimates how many people agree with one. Often when one is particularly passionate about a particular objective, one tends to surround oneself with people who echo the same beliefs or thoughts, and one can therefore be cancelling out the true objectivity. It's not to discount that where people are expressing the same concerns or observations, which are very valid, that those should be dismissed, but rather to just understand that because one is very confident in something, one might be overestimating the objectivity of the reality of what one is overestimating. The next is the optimism bias. This is where one overestimates a positive outcome and underestimates a negative outcome. And this is incredibly pervasive when it comes to planning the execution and anticipating when one will actually be able to deliver an outcome. Now, within our software, we have built in the tools that help overcome all of these particular items, but there's something about people when they plan things that they think that they can achieve a particular outcome in a far shorter period of time without taking into account the practical availability of resources and underestimating what things could change and go wrong along the way. The optimism bias can be overcome when one takes into account the most common variables that are often overlooked and built in a way that is very objective to anticipate particular outcomes. The next bias is a misinformation bias, and this is where one's memory is influenced by things that happen after an event. So if one experiences an event and asks someone about it, and then asks someone about that same event rather a couple months later, you may get a different recollection, and that's because once things have been spoken about and articulated and discussed and socialized after a particular event, that particular event can be recolored in one's mind, and therefore this can impair the ability to make particular decisions about the transformational strategy and change. And the way to overcome this is to make sure that one is looking at all the right factual information. Again, this is built into the software, but it's really important for one to understand why one is doing what one is doing. The next one is loss aversion, and this is where people avoid a potential loss versus the probability of a potential gain. And this really comes down to particular individuals as to which side of the scale they tend to have the aversion for. Where this impacts transformations and strategies is where people have a higher risk aversion and therefore avoid taking necessary steps that need to be taken in order to deliver ongoing operational success and change. Throughout the execution, especially when we go through the step-by-step execution, we will see that certain steps are taken in a particular order because what it does is it helps reprogram your brain and stop it from making these common mistakes. So for example, with the availability heuristic, it does force one to go back and collect the right information so that one is empowered to make a more objective assessment. And this is the same with something such as apophenia, as well as the framing bias, as well as the confirmation bias. So we'll see throughout our step-by-step execution that it's not random that we've chosen to do it in a particular order. Obviously, human beings like to think that we can do things in a different way. And if you are using the software, that's fine. You can start wherever you like. It will just nudge you to make sure that you haven't overlooked something that is going to cause what is a common error. Hopefully, this gives us a little bit of insight into why we approach things in a particular way to try set ourselves up for success, both from a technical execution perspective as well as from a human perspective. These 13 components, together with the interdependency pyramid, highlights the critical need for a synthesized transformation skill set because one does need to understand how the components interrelate with one another. And this applies from board level all the way to graduate level. And this synthesized skill set requires a baseline of 4 key components. There's an innovation skill set at play, there's a strategy skill set at play, there is a technical execution skill set at play, and of course there are the soft skills that underpin the delivery of all of this. And whilst we're at the introduction, by the time we have completed each one of the 13 components, we will have successfully completed a baseline skill set that has delivered a synthesized transformation skill set that covers every single one of these components. Our next concept, MVT, minimum viable transformation. For those who have worked in new product development, innovation departments, a new startup, MVT is like an MVP, minimum viable product, where rather than investing millions and just producing 1,000 of a product that you don't even know if it works the way you want it to work or if it's what the customer wants. One rather creates the first working version and tests it with customers before scaling that out. It is the same concept. So MVT is a minimum viable transformation, which says, let's create a small operational version of the transformation. Make sure it's architected correctly and actually delivering the outcome that one wants to achieve. And then from there, one can scale it. The genius part about an MVT is it accounts for the fact that reality is dynamic and that things don't always go according to plan, and there are nuances that need to be tweaked for existing operations in order for that change that you're trying to get done to be successful. So rather than mobilizing a transformation and literally disrupting the entire team or organization, one is able to architect it in a contained way, make tweaks without the mass disruption, and then scale something once it's already working. And what this also means is that one can deliver that contained change in a really small space of time, 6 to 8 weeks, and then it can be scaled really quickly, which means one is delivering the result at a much lower cost and a much faster pace, rather than the 18 to 24 months minimum to even get one thing done, which often results in failure anyway and a lot of wasted funds. To be clear, MVT is not a framework or a methodology and can be used with all frameworks and methodologies. So it is framework and methodology agnostic. It's rather just a logical way of bringing something to life. So irrespective of what your team or organization use on a day-to-day basis to run your operations, MVT can be successfully used with all of them. It's just a logical approach. What we're looking at over here looks rather complex, but basically what it's explaining is how we go from the current organization state to the future state and bring together both large-scale transformation components as well as the smaller component ones. And whilst this image may not make sense right now, within time, this is going to seem very, very simple. Let's go on to our next key concept, phases and iterations. We start by acknowledging that everything that we do is a hypothesis that needs to be validated. Now, a hypothesis is just a fancy word for saying it's a theoretical statement. And basically all transformations start with theoretical statements that are made up of a whole lot of different components, what we think the problem is, who are the people or organizations that we think have the problem, what are the processes that are involved, how do we think we're going to solve it. Each one of those is actually just a theoretical hypothesis that we need to validate whether it's true or not true. So what we need to do is break down each one of these components, i.e. a hypothesis, and then do something to validate that it is in fact correct and accurate. And every time we ensure that something is correct and accurate, we have actually added value to the transformation. Now we're going to look at all of these 13 components, and each one of these 13 components have a hypothesis that we're going to validate as true. And we're going to see exactly how to articulate that hypothesis and how to validate that they're true in the fastest possible way. But basically, these hypotheses fall into 3 categories. The first lot of hypotheses are what we call a value hypothesis. Basically, what the value hypothesis says is, as a result of doing whatever it is that we're going to do, we will provide the following value. So that is the actual solution that we're delivering. Does it create value for the end user and for the organization or team? The second category of hypotheses is a growth hypothesis. So the growth hypothesis basically says, is the solution scalable in the way that we need it to be scalable? Because one can create the most perfect solution that creates an inordinate amount of value, but it's done in a way that it can't actually be scaled, in which case it's not really a hypothesis or a model or a solution that we should be using. The third type of hypothesis is a viability hypothesis, and that is, can the value that one is creating and the model under which one anticipates scaling that be done in a way that is viable within the constraints required by the business? Does it produce the right amount of profitability or return on investment required? Does it produce the outcome within the constraints of perhaps resources or the political climate that the organization or team operates at? And so we will ensure that through the transformation does in fact deliver value at scale and in a way that is viable within the constraints desired by the organization. We're going to look at phases and iterations in more detail, but just at a really simple level, what we're basically doing is taking the transformation and breaking it down into steps, the same as you would break down a process into a step-by-step process, and therefore validate every single one of those steps to make sure that every single component within that process delivers the outcome that one has anticipated, rather than trying to do it all, deciding that the outcome wasn't achieved, but failing to understand that perhaps 8 out of the 10 steps were in fact doing what they were supposed to be doing, and it was 2 that were breaking it down. So rather than throwing out the entire transformation, we can identify which of the elements are working and therefore just zoom in on the ones to correct that are not currently working. And so that's why every single one of the 13 components does have a hypothesis that needs to be validated. And we can use the concept of MVTs to deliver these iterations, because MVTs enable us to test something in a small contained environment that doesn't create disruption in a really short period of time, sometimes even as successfully as in a couple of hours. And this actually helps us to deliver the transformation much faster. We're going to see how MVTs can be used in every single phase and iteration within that phase. If one were to look at successful transformations and take a step back, it becomes quite obvious that actually what happened is that it was delivered in phases. We are going to use specific words, but you are welcome to use different words should you want to implement it within your organization, or perhaps you do similar things but already using different words. So the first phase is, let's architect and set up the transformation. Architect is really at that theoretical hypothesis level. Theoretically, what do we think each one of those 13 components look like? And once we have theoretically got that down, we need to go away and validate it. Now, remember, there were external components and internal components. External was either external to the organization or external to your team. And then there are the internal components. So one goes away and validates this in a really quick and smart way. And in doing this, it is also validating the solution, which is ultimately what one is about to go and invest one's time and resources in bringing to life. However, one is bringing that to life in a continued iterative phase. The next step, and we actually insert this quite specifically, is a prioritization step. Many organizations actually do not do this. They have a list of things that they're going to go away and do, and it's quite a theoretical order. So we encourage organizations to stop and go through a very specific prioritization exercise that sets the organization up for momentum and for success in the actual constraints that the organization operates. We then get onto the execution phase. There are different words that can be used: build, measure, learn, build, test, learn. Perhaps your organization or you would like to use different words, but ultimately what one is doing is creating a small operational version, validating that that version works. And remember, that version could just be a component of the larger solution, but you want to make sure that perhaps the component that you're working on does in fact work. One can then test it. And then based on the test, one would have a learning. And based on the learning, one makes a decision about what to do next. And actually making a decision on what one is going to do next is quite simple. One is either going to persevere because one has sufficiently validated the solution or the part thereof. One might need to iterate, so it needs small little tweaks and then to be retested. Perhaps one needs to pivot, which means making a bit of a larger change in order to find the right solution. Or perhaps one is at a stage that it indicates that one actually needs to stop and restart because one is quite off course. And we have the pips tool, which is exactly what we've just looked at. Does one persevere, iterate, pivot, stop or restart? And we're going to look at that in detail in one of the later components, but it really just simplifies decision making, gives everyone great clarity, and is part of that dynamic governance process also. And once one has in fact built, measured and learned and validated the particular component, one is then able to scale the solution of that. And once one reaches the scale phase, you're actually right back to the beginning. You need to architect that scaling. One needs to then validate that scaling and then prioritize and execute, build, measure, learn from that. And that really is the phases simplified. As mentioned, you might like to use different words, but these are the words that we adopt going forward, and we use the MVT or iterations in actually bringing this to life. This can be used irrespective of perhaps the different type of project management methodology. There's PMBOK, Prince2, Scrum, Agile Scrum. They're all different types of project management approaches. This is agnostic across whatever approach it is that your organization likes to use. The next concept is design thinking. You may very well have heard of design thinking or even have gone through training or used it practically. It is very common in the development of new products. However, this ability to be innovative is actually required throughout transformation, even though we have to take that design thinking innovation skill set and elevate it with a lot more complexity. So design thinking actually originated out of Stanford D School. It is now called the Hasso-Plattner Institute. And really, it's just an approach for innovating. Now, we're going to look at there are 5 components to design thinking. And even though we're going to go through them in an order, in reality, they are not necessarily applied in sequential order. We'll look at that in a moment. So let's look at the 5 components. The first component is empathize. Now, empathy is often seen as this soft, intangible thing that may not really be relevant. If one looks at extremely successful organizations and leaders, their strongest attribute is empathy, because what empathy actually allows one to do is get to the absolute quintessential root of all problems and ability to actually influence the outcome of problems. Empathy means that one can actually step into the shoes of another person, group, team, organization, or process, and be able to understand what it is that they need. And when one understands the true need, one is able to actually solve the real problem. The next component is define, and that is one needs to really articulate exactly what the problem is. If one doesn't articulate accurately what the problem is, it's ultimately going to result in an incorrect solution. However, one always needs to come back to the problem that one defined in order to ascertain, is the solution that one is creating in fact solving the thing that it's supposed to solve? And whilst this might sound obvious, it is all too common that organizations kick something off with a whole set of actions, and then because things don't always go according to plan and people lose track of sight of what they're supposed to be doing, changes start getting made to the solution without people realizing that every time they make one of those tweaks to the solution, it's moving them away from solving the true problem that needs to be solved, and as a consequence, that solution is actually not relevant to what the ultimate users needed that solution to provide to them. So that is why it's really important to make sure that the problem and the objective is really well defined. That brings us on to the third component. So the third component is called ideate. This is the brainstorming, getting all the ideas together as to all the myriad of ways that one could potentially solve the problem that one has defined. There are a whole lot of tools in how to do this, but that is the step. Ideate is about how do we actually solve the problem and bring this together into a solution that we can then go away and, fourth component of design thinking, create a prototype. So in transformation, this might be a little bit like our MVT, our minimum viable transformation, but let's put together a solution that's quite operational and practical and see how it works. And once we've got that together, we're in a position to go away and actually test it. And the testing it is, well, we're only at a point that's theoretical now. Let's validate that it does in fact generate the right solution and solve the problem. And that is why this is not a linear process. So for example, we would need to empathize and use our empathy skill in order to apply it to every single one of these steps. So at prototype stage, it's important to go back to the empathy stage and say, based on what we have prototyped, is this something that the end user is going to actually adopt in using based on their environment, not the environment that we think is perfect, but based on the practical environment of what the end user actually exists. Similarly, the reason that it's not linear is one might actually discover in testing phase that things didn't go quite according to how we thought it would, which means maybe we have to just go back to the idea stage and go, look, we need to come up with a better idea. Or perhaps at the testing stage, we discover that we've actually defined the problem incorrectly and we need to go back to the define stage. And this is why design thinking is not a linear process, but can be used jumping between all the different steps based on what it is that we need to solve at the time. And we will see how we actually do use this innovation skill set together with other technical and soft skill sets in delivering transformation. Our next concept is the adoption curve, which many find very fascinating. It is also known as the innovation adoption curve, Rogers adoption curve, or the theory of the diffusion of innovation. It was developed in 1962 by Everett, and it's there to help us understand how certain groups of people who demonstrate particular attributes will adopt a new way of thinking, a new product, a new thought process, a new set of behaviors. differently to other groups. And therefore, if we can understand the different attributes in the different groupings, we're therefore able to influence increasing the pace at which a new way of thinking, a new product is adopted. Understanding adoption and how one can influence and identify different groupings helps transformations from a whole lot of different angles. Firstly, from actually getting people to adopt the new way of working, but even before that, getting people to adopt the process that is ultimately going to deliver the transformation. And this is going to be used as an influencing tool, as we will see in all different components of the transformation. Technically, the adoption curve is a histogram. The histogram is actually the bell curve that many of us may be familiar with from school in terms of how they used to place our grades. So let's have a look at the breakdown of the adoption curve with what we call adopter categories. We kick off with the innovators. These are the people who are inspired to kick off the solution, and we're actually going to go and break down every single one of these adopter categories into more detail in a moment. The next thing is the early adopters, and from the early adopters, we move into the early majority. Now, many make the mistake of thinking because they have early adopters using a solution that they have come up with, that they have in fact cracked the solution, where in fact the requirements of the early majority are somewhat different to the early adopters. And therefore, there is this thing called crossing the chasm, and it is where many solutions, new products, habits die is in the chasm. But the point is, and we'll see this in a moment, that we mustn't make the mistake that if there are people using the solution, that we have in fact been successful in finding what is required in order to deliver the transformation objective. From there, we get the late majority, and really what a successful transformation looks like is having gained the early majority and the late majority's buy-in to actively using whatever the new habit, new way of thinking, new product, new service, new process is. And after that, we have the laggards. Now, very often the amount of effort that is required to get the laggards on board is not necessarily worth the investment, but we're going to see what the attributes are of each of these. What we are looking at is the adoption curve, and each one of these are called adopter categories. So just to recap, the adopter categories are the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. Let's systematically understand what are the unique attributes in each one of these categories, and from that we're able to identify in our day-to-day workings who possibly falls into each one of these categories. Now, we need to be mindful that depending on what the new habit, way of thinking, product, process is, different people will fall into different categories, and the same person might fall into different categories depending on what the habit or product or process is. Let's recap on each of the adopter categories. So each one of the groupings within the adoption curve, those are called adopter categories. And as we recall, each segment we then break down into these adopter categories. So let's start with the first one, which is known as our innovators. So that's the first 2.5% of the histogram curve. That's the bell curve. We might be familiar with the bell curve from when one was at school, and it depended on where one fell on the bell curve in terms of whether one passed or failed, but it's the same shape curve. So the innovators, these are the first people to try new ideas. These are the people putting their hands up to be part of building that idea. They're often more adventurous, they're open to taking risks, and they don't take a lot of convincing to get them to be part of building the new solution or trying the new solution. Now, one needs to just bear in mind that when we define people in terms of the adopter categories, this is not pervasively defining an entire person. And a person may be an innovator in one realm, but maybe a late majority in another realm. So just bear that in mind, that we're not always putting people into a category in terms of defining them as a person as a whole, but we're defining the person in the context of the particular problem or solution that we're aiming to deliver. The next category is the early adopters. These are people who are aware of the problem or need and they wish to change it. So they're open to change and they need very little convincing to try get them to actually adopt the new solution. And very often one can identify these people by looking at those who are already trying to figure out workarounds. They're coming up with solutions that just help them get the job done in order to avoid the current pain point. Strategically, all one really needs to do is provide this group of people with a how-to guide in order to get them to try the product or solution. But then that gets us to the early majority. Now, the early majority is a little bit more complicated, and that is why it's called the chasm. There is a gap between the early adopters and the early majority, and the reason that things fail is because early adopters don't need much convincing, and they're happy to just try it, and they won't mind if the solution is a little clunky and needs refining, whereas the early majority are not accepting of this, and therefore the solution needs to be a lot more refined and working far more smoothly in order for them to continue using it. So strategically, they are going to need evidence of success stories, and therefore if one has identified the early adopters, one can use the success stories as demonstrated by the early adopters to then have the early majority try the solution. Very often the early adopters will also articulate their satisfaction with the solution and therefore influence the early majority. So these people are not necessarily your leaders, but they are open to change before the average individual. The next is the late majority. They're far more skeptical and risk averse. Now, what they're open to adopting is only once there's a lot more evidence of it being used successfully, and therefore the early majority using the solution provides one with the evidence needed to get the late majority to then consider using the solution. And therefore what one does is actually use this success of how many times it has already been used successfully in order to get the late majority to consider using the solution. And then lastly, we have what we call laggards. They're generally extremely risk adverse and conservative. There is a possibility that there is a laggard somewhere in an organization. Perhaps they haven't adopted a new solution, but that is often because they may not be aware of the new solution. But other than that, it's because laggards are actually very risk adverse. And the best way to get laggards to adopt things is actually through peer pressure. One of the most powerful things that we can learn from the adoption curve and notice is that in many organizations and teams that we've been part of, an extensive amount of time and resource has been invested into trying to get people who fall into the early majority, late majority, and laggards to adopt a new way of thinking, new product, new solution, new process right at the beginning, when in fact the evidence and what they need strategically in order to try the new product, process, skill, way of thinking or doing things does in fact not exist. And often at that point, organizations or teams feel that something has been a failure. However, the learning is to say, well, let's look at a segment, break it down into our innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards, and only then do we choose actions and strategies that are directed at each one of those categories in a particular order. Because what this means is that we would have to invest far less time and energy, and it would be a targeted effort, because what is needed for the early majority is not what is needed for the late majority. What is needed for the early adopters is far less onerous than what is needed for the late majority. Not only do we get a far faster adoption rate, but we get it at a far lower cost, both in financial terms and the amount of energy. And therefore, it's really important to always come back and visit this adoption curve, which we will see throughout the 13 components. And if one is using the software, what one will notice is that this is continuously tracked so that we can ensure that we get the best possible outcome in the shortest possible period of time. We now introduce our next concept of neuroscience, and we do it at a very high level because it is quite intricate, very, very interesting, but we're going to go into it in more detail in the later components where we actually have to implement it, such as in momentum and pace and change management and governance and metrics. And what this is about is how does one take the technical execution and align it with how the human brain naturally works, i.e. the neuroscience. And to do this, we will look at various elements. And whilst they're very interesting, we will see how to apply it in later components. The first thing is the habit loop. The habit loop, you might be familiar with if you've read Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's not where it originally originated, but let's look at it through that lens. It has 4 components. The first one is the cue. The second one is the craving. The third one is the response. And the fourth thing is the reward. Now let's put this into a practical example. A cue would be something like you get a Facebook notification. So it is your cue that there is something waiting there for you. The craving is your wanting to know what's waiting for you. Looking at another example, perhaps when you're tired, that's your cue that you might want chocolate or coffee, and the thing that you're craving is the awake feeling as a result of having the chocolate or the coffee. The response is then the action that one takes as a result of receiving the cue and anticipating the reward. Perhaps you click on your notification or open your Facebook app to see what is all going on there, or you go ahead and you purchase the coffee and you drink it, and likewise with the chocolate. And then the reward is the enjoyment of the outcome that you get from taking the response action. So one knows what the notification was all about, or one has the awake feeling from the chocolate or the coffee. Now, often the actual experience of the reward is not as powerful as the craving for the reward, but we're going to get into that interesting detail in the later components. Now, there's something called the hook model, which Nira Eyal is very famous for. There's a fantastic book called Hooked, which I highly recommend. And the hook model and the habit loop are absolutely in agreement with each other. Just the hook model elevates it to one more level of complexity, which really empowers us from a transformation perspective to be highly, highly effective. So let's look at the 4 elements of the hook model. The hook model is made up of a trigger. The trigger is not dissimilar to the cue. The trigger is the thing that triggers one to want to take some kind of action. Hence the notification on Facebook, the feeling of feeling tired. The next thing in the hook model is action. The trick to action is it needs to require the least amount of effort in order for the person to get the outcome. So for example, if you were searching for something on a website and it became really difficult to find where or what it was, you would probably close that website and go on to the next one because the action became too complicated for you to receive what is ultimately the reward that you're looking for. The next thing in the hook model is variable reward. So this differs a little bit because it's variable reward, not reward. And there is a difference in reward and variable reward, where variable reward can be more powerful in getting people to adopt an outcome, but also continue using the new way of thinking, the new habit that you want them to adopt, the new product or the new process. And we're going to come to why variable reward is so much more powerful in a moment. And the last element of the hook model is investment. And this is something that doesn't exist in the habit loop. The investment is about how does one actually keep one there. So a great example is perhaps with Pinterest, where people collect a whole lot of images, perhaps of what they want to decorate or renovate their new house to look like, or their wedding. Now, because one has invested a whole lot of time, it's unlikely that if there were to be a new version of Pinterest that one would just very quickly move over, or one wouldn't delete one's Facebook account because it's got a history of all your photos there. So that's an example of investment. So it shouldn't be mistaken just with financial investment. It's actually emotional investment. And we can see this highly effectively used in transformations, especially with people's reward systems, where if there is a greater reward for employees at the end of a transformation and they can accumulate credits in the process, one really does keep them there a lot longer. This could include, for example, upskilling towards an actual degree that will set them apart from the rest going forward, or promotions and so on. So let's just revisit this thing called variable reward, and we're going to go into it in detail in later components, but it is very exciting and it's one of the things that I like the most in designing transformations. And this is the variable reward schedule. It is developed by B.F. Skinner, and he is a social psychologist, and we'll go into the detail. But basically, when one is using reward systems to influence behavior, one can actually break down rewards into different structures, and depending on how one structures that will depend on the rate at which individuals adopt certain behavior, but not just the rate at which they adopt it, the rate at which it may become extinct. And there's certain behaviors that perhaps if they were quite easy to adopt and it wouldn't require a whole lot of influencing, then you would want to choose a different type of reward to first kickstart that behavior, versus other ones that are perhaps a little bit more complex but highly critical and will take more time for individuals to get used to, that would require a different type of reward system. But firstly, it starts with, is it fixed versus variable? And is it ratio versus intermittent? I.e., is it a consistent time frame, or is it an intermittent, unpredictable time frame? And once one starts combining all those different elements, one can have a different impact in how quickly people adopt certain outcomes. Very interesting. We will see you in later components to see how we can bring that to life, both in how we design our processes within organizations, our products that we're offering to customers, and how one influences our teams to be inspired, innovative, and engaged in the workplace, and also to retain them going forward. We will also see how we can use this neuroscience and rewards in the transformation execution process, i.e. the different phases, because ultimately we want to get the teams through the different phases as quickly as possible. And this reward schedule can be structured in such a way that we do encourage that behavior at the right pace at the right times. And as mentioned, this can also be applied in actually getting organizations and teams within organizations to adopt certain processes within the organization more quickly or more slowly. And there will be more detail of that later on. I'm sure you can tell by the enthusiasm in my voice just how exciting this particular component is. And that brings us to a close of the key concepts for this particular section. However, we now need to take these key concepts and turn them into practical reality. And to do so, we're going to go through literally the step-by-step process in order to bring that to life. It's a little bit like for dummies, not because any of us are dummies, but if I was having to execute a heart transplant, something that I'd never done before, I really would want someone to break it down into the step-by-step details so that I can practically implement it. So in delivering the technical execution, we're literally going to upskill ourselves step by step right now. We have to make sure that we're doing it in the most efficient gold standard way. And that is exactly what we're about to look at, the efficient gold standard way. We're going to do it step by step so that there is clear understanding in terms of how we get to the ultimate answer, and a number of mediums that you might be using, which you can use to execute the next step-by-step component. You might just have the practical pen and paper version. However, if you have access to the software or would like access to the software, please just do pop through a message to the Impact team. They'd love to give you access to the software. The single point of truth, which we're going to use as our starting point right now, is within the software, and all of these things will be fully automated within there. You might already be using it as part of a transformathon, or perhaps you're actually part of a transformation program, in which case you'll be able to see within the software, once you click on here, everything always links back to your color-coded single point of truth. And so what we're going to be seeing now on the screen is exactly as what one might see in the technology. It's just the technology is a lot more interactive and colorful and integrated and automated and all those fun things that save us time and energy. So just to kickstart, what we're going to do is we're going to take our single point of truth and we're going to fill in every single one of those 13 blocks with a starting hypothesis, i.e. the starting theory of what should be expressed in every single one of those boxes that we need to then test are actually true in order to bring it to life. And it will also set us up for understanding this whole concept of we first architect it, then we need to validate that it's true, and then we go away and we build something that is actually going to deliver the output in practical reality. Now, right now, you can click into the software and do it within the software. Obviously, if you're working on a team, you're all collaborating in the same single point of truth and the same transformation component. Alternatively, one is welcome to use a pen and paper right now, just bearing in mind that this is exclusive intellectual property. And what we're going to do is complete every single one of these components. And because we're in the introduction component, the chances are one is at architecture phase, but we will use this exact same single point of truth right now at architecture phase throughout the validation and then the execution component. And what we fill into each one of these components is that hypothesis that we're going to go away and validate. Obviously, if you're using the software, you've seen that it shows you exactly how to validate it and how to bring everything to life in iterations when one executes it, and it does it in a particular order for you. But what sits in each one of these components is what we call a Mad Lib. So what we've gone away and done is bring in that communication skill, which says we have worked out the simplest way to express something that everyone can understand, where it includes all the information. So that is what the Mad Lib is. And within a Mad Lib, you basically need to fill in the missing words. So we're going to systematically work through every single one of these components to insert the hypothesis that we're then going to, in the next phase, execute. So let's kick off. Step number 1. Let's fill in the problem. Now, as we know, the problem might turn out to be slightly different, but this is how we express the problem. The entity or team with the problem needs to do something because something. So let's take, for example, a finance transformation that needs to ultimately deliver value to its end users, which may be the sales team, the marketing team, the leadership. So let's practically apply this. Perhaps there's an element of the finance transformation where they need to deliver useful information to a board in a timely manner. So perhaps this is what their problem statement might look like. The board and leadership of the organization needs accurate and granular information in order to make decisions about where to strategically move the business going forward. That would be their objective. Now, in a finance transformation, there may be a sales team that also needs information in order to create accurate pitches. There might be a marketing team that needs reliable information in order to know where to invest their marketing spend to increase sales. Each one of these customer groups are ultimately looking for information in order to improve decision-making abilities, therefore increasing revenue. Which brings us on to the next block, which is all about the customer and the channel. And here we're going to break down specifically who are the customer personas. One needs to be quite specific. Can't just say users of financial information. Let's be specific. It is the board or leadership. It is the sales team. It is the finance team. We're then going to hypothesize what channels do each one of these need to receive their information through. Do they need to get it through a digital channel? Does it need to come to them online? Or is it a physical channel, an actual printed report? Does it need to come directly or indirectly? Which brings us on to the next component. Are there competitors in this area? Perhaps you're part of a broader group and another team is trying to do the same thing and actually there's internal conflict and competition. Or perhaps you're actually creating a new product, in which case there are external competitors that one needs to take into account. Not dissimilarly, there are actually alternatives that are available. So sometimes one doesn't need to go and create software from scratch. Perhaps there's something off the shelf that can already do that. Perhaps there's information already sitting in another system, in another team that one needs, and one can just draw that information in, and that would be your alternative. Rather than reinventing the wheel that already exists in the organization, go find out what those alternatives are. There are often very easy to use off-the-shelf software solutions that can solve problems that often organizations go away and invest a lot of money in developing. This brings us on to step number 4, which is the value proposition. So let's complete the value proposition, and the Mad Lib for the value proposition I'm going to read out to you. The product or the solution is for the particular customer that we have identified, who wants or needs to. There's something that they need or want to do, which is basically solving what we identified in the problem. The solution is, it falls into a particular category that provides a key benefit. Now, this is starting to look rather complex, but once we've gone through the value proposition component, it actually makes this really, really obvious. So let's play this out. The real-time end-of-month report is for the leadership, sales, and marketing team who need to make strategic decisions in order to increase revenue. This is one of the finance team's end-of-month solutions that will provide the benefit of the organization being able to make decisions to be more profitable. We are going to do this in the following, and here we limit it to 3 to 5 ways. We are going to make sure that all data is now captured in one particular portal rather than the current systems, so that all numbers enter at the same point. We are going to redo the reports by consulting with the end users to ensure that it has the information that they need. And we're going to change reports into real time, which means they can access it at any given point in time in order to make the decisions. The last thing that we're going to do is ensure that there are visuals associated with this, which makes it really easy to interpret the data. And those would be the value propositions that you would then go away and work on once you have validated that that's the solution that the customers in fact do want. The next step is to complete the centers of excellence. Once one has insight into what the value proposition is that one needs to deliver, it will very quickly highlight what are the core competencies that one has to be really excellent at in order to deliver the outcome that one needs. And these become your centers of excellence, and centers of excellence are sets of skills that may not necessarily all reside in one single team. But the objective of the center of excellence is to ensure that whatever that competence is, that one is always a forerunner in providing that competency, which means those people who belong to that center of excellence need to always be revisiting the center of excellence, what processes and technology are being used in order to deliver it, and ensure that that's always being upgraded so that one doesn't need a wholesale transformation at a later point. So going back to our finance transformation example, maybe some of the centers of excellence would be excellence at governance, i.e. making sure that information gets in there accurately and that all risks are mitigated in terms of delivering on that. The next center of excellence might be analytics, the ability to interrogate and represent data. Another center of excellence could be reporting. And another center of excellence could be transactional services. So this ability to complete routine and repeatable actions in the most efficient and effective way possible. Step number 6 is defining our vision, and we use the MADlib. Could be the team, the company's mission is to serve X purpose for the following users through. So in the example of the finance transformation, my reporting, planning and analysis team is here to provide reliable, insightful information to the leadership, sales and marketing team through real-time data in order for them to make good strategic decisions that will increase revenue. Step number 7 is all about ways of working. So these are our processes and technology. If one is actually using the software, you will see that there are already pre-populated options that will help you define this with a little bit more detail. But let's stick to just the high-level MADlib as a start. First, we're going to articulate what are the processes that we're going to require and the key differences from today, and what is the supporting technology that we're going to need in order to do this. So if this was a pure finance transformation, perhaps it might read like this. The key processes are month-end reporting and the distribution of important real-time information. And the key difference between today and the future is that month-end reporting will be available rather than from day 10, from day 2. And the process will need to facilitate providing both insights as well as different tools. And therefore, the changes of the key technology that will be required is a real-time data tool and a single point of truth for capturing all sorts of data, which is not currently the technology that is underway. If you're using our software, you'll see that it actually gives you some options to help you quickly identify what future applications and infrastructure one might want to be using that would be different from today. However, that is for a future section, so we're not going to touch on that in detail right now. But that does bring us on to step number 8, which is actually all about the resources. And here one needs to identify what are the long-term skills and architecture that one needs. By architecture, we mean what is the structure of the team, and what is the skills and architecture one needs in order to deliver the actual execution. And in the context of a finance transformation, perhaps the long-term skill sets are data analytics, reporting accuracy, and standards compliance. And perhaps the team structure might need to change from today we use a very hierarchical order, whereas in the future we're going to need a matrix structure that allows for interaction with the different divisions. This brings us on to number 9, which is all about priorities, plan and alignment. And here one wants to identify theoretically the order in which one thinks one is going to deliver against this. And we're going to create this in the following order. We are first going to define all the sources of data and convert them into one source of data. The second thing will be to reconfigure reports in order to ensure that they are providing the information that we need. And the last thing we'll do is to provide this in real time with new technology tools. One would like to indicate then maybe what sense of alignment one currently has. And I would say at this stage, the alignment status would be a work in progress. This brings us on to the most important part, an ingredient that many people miss out, and that is momentum and pace. And here, just to start off with, even though we're not going into the architecture of how to do it, we're basically going to identify when one anticipates delivering this by, how many interim milestones there are, and if one is anticipating running sprints, the duration of those sprints. So here we might say that the full delivery date is expected in 12 months from now. We anticipate that there are 8 key milestones, and we would have defined those milestones in the plan component, which we didn't do right now because we don't really have the detail in order to do that. And then the final thing would be, we anticipate being able to do this in periods of 2 weeks, where we are able to run iterations of the reporting in that period of time. That brings us on to our next element, and that is metrics. Here we're just really going to identify the key metrics that we think are going to deliver success. Obviously, when we get to this component, we will learn that there's probably different metrics that will set us up for greater success, but perhaps something like this for our finance transformation, our metrics would be the number of new deals that are signed as a result of more meaningful information by the sales team, a satisfaction score provided by the board and leadership in terms of information being provided on time and providing effective information, and some kind of score that would also reflect the effectiveness of the data for the marketing team. If one has access to the current information, one would want to insert now that baseline metric, and then one would want to also indicate what the actual target is that one wants to hit. So do you want a satisfaction score of at least 9 out of 10 from the leadership team? How many number of new pitches do you want to see being signed as a result of the effective information being provided to the sales team? And that brings us on to the next component down here at the bottom on the right, which is our change management element. That's all about people. If you have used our insights and diagnostic tools, actually helped you identify who these people should be initially for obviously to revisit when we get to the change management component. But here we're going to identify who should the sponsor be, i.e. who's going to push this initiative that you are undertaking in terms of being transformed. So in this instance, it could be the CFO, the CEO, perhaps it's the head of the reporting, planning and analysis team. The adapters, these are the people who are going to adapt to the outcome of the solution. So perhaps in this instance, it's going to be the sales team, the marketing team and the leadership, because they're going to receive your information and they might need to do something differently. It could also be the data capturing team if they're not actually within your finance function and perhaps sit somewhere out in shared services. One would want to identify who one thinks the initial solution builders are. So perhaps one has some insight into who those members in the actual finance team would be. Perhaps there's people that you already have earmarked in the technology team, your IT team. But we will obviously revisit this to validate it in detail, identify who is really good at influencing people and would be a really effective communicator. Again, if you've used the software, this would have come out of your insights and purpose tool, and who you think would be a great person to manage this and ultimately also be responsible for ensuring that the change is delivered. Obviously, this was a greater project. There's a good chance that the organization might want a project manager, but very much project management and change management on smaller initiatives can be managed by the teams themselves effectively, because this is ultimately how they get their daily jobs done. And this brings us on to step number 13 of our step-by-step, and let's fill in the Mad Lib basically for the governance component. And here what we're going to do is just take a stab at who we think that the key decision makers need to be. Your sponsor is often the key decision maker for the big milestones. One also then needs decision makers for the interim steps. And so basically one wants to just identify who do you think would be a great person to be making the decisions at key milestones and then also all the way down to daily operations, remembering that your sponsor and those people who make decisions at key milestones are not readily available, and one wants to set this up for pace, and therefore someone who is available and close to the detail on a daily basis is the best person to identify in that area. In terms of the expected costs and benefits, one might not have insight at all as to the expected costs, so you could put a number in there randomly or actually just leave it out. And in terms of the expected benefits, there are expected benefits that one would expect to see because this is the whole objective of the transformation, and this might be seeing month end reduce from perhaps 10 working days to 2 working days, satisfaction score of the leadership, and the financial benefits seen by the sales and marketing team having useful data in order to make their decisions. And that is the whirlwind step-by-step set of actions that we can take just at the end of the introduction, bearing in mind that this was not meant to be overwhelming and that actually we're going to go into each one of these 13 components to really help us understand how we got to that Mad Lib and simplify and make it really clear as to how we got there. We just really start here so that one can see all the different components that one actually has to consider. And I'm sure in completing this, there are many components that one realized one actually didn't have clarity on or wasn't exactly sure how to get to. And if one were to mobilize some kind of strategy or transformation without actually going through each one of these 13 components, one has ultimately set oneself up for failure before even starting. So for us, the biggest learning coming out of having to go through this introduction step by step of just taking a stab at completing every single one of these components is just to really realize what each one of these components actually entail and highlight to oneself perhaps where the knowledge gaps are missing. And going forward in completing the 13 components, hopefully by the end of that, it will be super simple and clear, and one will have acquired the baseline transformation execution skill set. This brings us to the close of this component. We are very passionate about transformation, strategic change and innovation, and we'd really like to hear about what you're working on. And if there are any questions that we can answer, please do reach out. If you're already using the software, you might have your consultancies and implementation partners already plugged in there, and they're very easily accessible because they're basically working as if they're the same team. Otherwise, please do feel free to contact us through any one of our social media or email platforms that are available to you. There's also an interactive forum that you can participate in, and we have other resources that hopefully can be supportive. Congratulations! This brings us to the close of this component and being one step closer to having that full synthesized skill set that underpins successfully delivering change, transformation, and strategy, whether one is the CEO, the head of a team, or a graduate. And we're looking forward to seeing you in the next component. If one does require a CPD certificate, that's a compulsory professional development point, and it has not come through automatically, please do pop us an email on global@impactit.com.